Hi, this is CJ with CompRCC.com, and in this video I'm going to be assembling the axles, and during the process I'm going to do some things to help make sure that they are water resistant. There's no way to completely waterproof things, but water resistant is the factor. Also, I'm adding some additional parts for strengthening. Now, if you take a look at these items, you can probably tell which ones were stock and which ones do you think are stronger? These or these? This is an aftermarket set of gears. As you can see, the gears are helically cut versus straight cut gears. There's varying opinions and there's a lot of myths about helical gears. They can be stronger. They do create more torque force, so the structure around them and the axles have to be strong. But certainly the material that these are made out of is considerably stronger than these. These stock gears do tend to get chewed up. So I bought a set of these. As I said, this is an axial upgrade part. And instead of the gear being the pinion gear being a separate item from the axle and having to have a pin, which is also a point of failure, as well as the gears getting torn up, this is made as a single piece item. So first I'm going to assemble it's not really a differential, it's a locker, but the reason this isn't just a solid piece axle with a gear on it, there has to be a certain give, there has to be some room for things to flex and move, and a single piece axle would not work. So that's what they have, these little lockers, and the axle shafts slide in like so, and that gives this a little bit of room to move left and right, and the axles to move a little bit in and out. Now I've also gotten an axial aftermarket item to replace the front axles, which use a dog bone type of joint. This is stronger, it's more of a CV style joint, and it can hit a steeper angle and still rotate without generating lash or locking. So that's going to improve the turning radius of the vehicle and its longevity. Now these just drop in, and they have a gasket, but even though they don't call for putting a little bit of grease in here, I have seen axles taken apart after a good bit of off-road use, mud, water, etc., and these do get water in them. It does find its way down the shaft. So I am going to put a little bit of marine grease in these. You'll see that I did not tighten that down all the way. There's a gasket there, and you want to make sure these screws go into each one of these holes without taking any gasket material with them. And there we go. Always tighten stuff like this in a star pattern. Okay, that's one. While I'm at this, I'm going to go ahead and build up both of these. If you haven't caught this from a previous video, this is marine grease. It's a Lucas product. There are some marine greases out there that are water soluble. You do not want one of those. I'm surprised they even call it marine grease if it's water soluble. But be sure that when you get marine grease, that it is not water soluble. I've mentioned this in other videos, but one of the really nice things about these Axial kits is the number of extra parts they provide. If you read the description on the Dingo, it says that it has a 3-link suspension front and rear, and most people try to go with the 4-link. The 4-link gives you a little bit more articulation. It's more of a true off-road setup. They provide all the parts. You can build this out of the box with a 4-link suspension or a 3-link suspension. It's kind of interesting that they say that it's this has 3-link suspension, but it does have the extra arms that you need. It's got 8 arms plus the arms for using a 3-link, and it's got the axle mounts for a 4-link or the axle mounts for 3. I'm going with the 4-link setup. I'm going to go ahead and put the front one together first, since I've got these axles built up. I built these up off camera. They go together very quickly. There's nothing much to it. It's just a normal CV pin type setup. As you can see from the coloring in there, I put a generous amount of marine grease in the socket there and on all the parts as I assembled. And now I'm going to need to put some grease on this gear. Don't need to overdo it, but again, considering what I'm planning on doing with this truck, I'm going to be waterproofing all the electronics, and this is going to go underwater. So I'm going to pack a little bit of extra grease around the outside of this bearing. And before I put on the ends of the axle out here, I'll be packing this bearing again. Put a little bit of extra in here. Again, this won't make it waterproof, but it does provide a higher level of water resistance. Okay, so there we go. Nice and messy. Not overly greased up, but a bit of a barrier here, barrier here. There'll be more on this side as well, and that should keep this from getting too much water in it. Now, water can get in through these holes past the bolts. It can get in along the seam of the axle. There's just lots of opportunities, and these are going to have to get broken down and cleaned from time to time. Now there are 4 short and 4 longer bolts. The 2 shorter bolts are going to go through here on either side. And that's what these little nuts are for. And I'm not going to tighten that yet, just snug it down. And the 2 longer screws are going to screw in through this. This is the 4-link mount. If you were building with 3-link, you would be using this. Now, since these are screwing into plastic, be careful not to screw them in too tight. You definitely don't want to pull those through. Because if you strip that out, that's it. Put a nice coating of grease on the front of that bearing. And now, this is another important step. The amount of caster has to be correct. So I need to make sure I'm putting the right one of these, and that would be incorrect. Okay. Let me just show you. If I line this up with the holes, you can see the angle for this kingpin versus the axle. If this was to be straight up and down, the axle's pointing down. That means I've got the wrong side. If I take this one and put it in place, and there you can see now that the drive shaft coming out here, the stub, is pointed upwards a little bit versus the kingpin angle. That would explain it. Okay. Because I'm using the aftermarket axles, and again, this is something I'm kind of figuring out as I go because this is not in the instructions. This does not slide over. You've got to pull the axle out because it's not a dog bone. Otherwise, I could have just slid that on. You know, what washes away gets washed away. What gets flung off gets flung off, but it's definitely worth having that little bit of extra waterproofing protection there. Now I just need a couple of little button head screws to anchor this on, and those are 2mm. Those are 2mm. These are self-tapping screws. You can tell by the coarseness of the thread, by the way it tapers a little bit. You always want to be very careful about not over tightening these. They will rip out the hole that you're screwing it into. They will just tear through and you'll never get them to tighten again. So just snug them into place. You don't have to worry about them wiggling loose. And this is not a part that is going to have a lot of stress on it. Not to the point where you're going to worry about these screws holding it in. It's this part that is going to be the failure point at steering. And these knuckles can be upgraded. Axial makes a very nice set of aluminum ones, and there's also a lot of aftermarket companies. If you know anything about crawlers, you know that there is a vast aftermarket out there producing all kinds of nifty little items. Sorry to run off for a second there. I needed to dig out a couple of little items from another hardware bag. Had a bunch of items that I'm not going to be using, like the dog bone outers for the old axles, and putting away these gears, basically saving everything I'm not going to use. So now we need our steering linkages, and on this vehicle, these face forward. Just want to see if there is any asymmetry, if there's a left or right difference, and there does not appear to be. And those really can use a little bit of grease too. When you're building gearboxes, you want to be careful about putting too much grease in. You don't want things to be inefficient because they're just packed. At the same time, when you're building a vehicle like this that you're going to do a lot of off-roading with, parts like this that are out in the open, it's definitely worth putting that little extra bit on, because a lot of this will wash off or get splashed off, and there's going to be sand and all kinds of other stuff. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of clean out those holes a bit. I'm going to be putting self-tappers through there. This is probably one of the first bearings to go because it is very exposed, that and the inner bearing here. I've got both my little steering pieces on there. That was one advantage of greasing those up. They would have certainly fallen out of here during the process of putting that bearing in. Now, because there are these little bushings in here, you really don't need to tighten these down. They're self-tapping, so you don't have to worry about them backing out. You don't need Loctite, and you definitely don't want to crank down on them. Not just because you're worried about them pulling out of the knuckle, but because you don't want them compressing that little bushing. You don't want any binding in your steering. So you just want to cinch them down so there's no play. But you want a nice smooth steering action. I'm going to leave these two off because I'm not 100% sure that they have provided me hardware, or that there isn't something that sandwiches in underneath here, because you can see there's space on either side. So I'm just going to wait on those. The directions show a 3-link, not a 4-link. So those will get tackled in a little bit. I'm going to move on to the rear axle. And I need to make sure that this is totally seated in place. That will work nicely. There you go. You really need to press that bearing in hard. That is definitely an area where water is going to try to infiltrate. So I'm not going to be shy about using grease in there. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and grease this up really good before I put it in. There we go. Nice smooth gear action. Those may be getting bearings in them. Let's go ahead and take care of that first. I'm going to use the axle to slide this down in, because that will make sure the bearing stays flat and doesn't go in at an angle and be harder to put in. Okay, those don't seem to press in, they just seem to sit in place. This big blob on the end here against that little shank. When this slides in, that will press that grease up against the bearing and provide a little bit of a grease barrier in there. Now, unlike the way I did the transmission, where I sealed all the way around the edge of the transmission with grease, just a little bit of a bead to create a water barrier, there are just too many ways for water to get into these axles. Water can get in past the screws into these holes. It can get in down the shaft, past the bearing. You can get in around this edge. You can get in around the seam here. You can get in past these screws. I would need to use little O-rings or put a little bit of silicone, or certainly just wads of grease at all sides here. It's just not worth doing that. But we're doing what can be done to try to make it so I don't have to break this down every time I get it saturated. And especially for some of the people who do a lot of crawling in mud and water, I wouldn't be surprised if they have to tear down their axles and other parts of the truck on a fairly regular basis. It's kind of interesting that these posts here and here, the axles are identical front to rear, with the exception of what is on the outers. And that has some possibilities. For example, if you wanted a truck to turn very, very tightly, you could potentially get the various parts, axles, hubs, and knuckles, and build a steering axle in the rear, mount a second servo. I'm not going to cover exactly how you would connect the two, but there is a way to do dual steering using two separate servos. And that would make an SCX10 turn very, very sharply. There we go. Nice, smooth action. It feels really smooth. Great. Okay. So there's our two axles. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's definitely a greasy, grimy video, but it's worth going through that extra effort and going through the slime and using all this marine grease, because it is going to make this last a lot longer. It's going to run a lot better.